Prologue. When she opened her eyes, Neera didn't know where she was. The light was dim, and her body ached. The floor underneath her was cold and hard. She shifted, and straw dug into her ribs. She blinked a few times before she remembered. The dungeon. A cell meant for a prisoner, not for a woman who wanted nothing but to survive. It was a cruel, cruel world. Neera pursed her lips together and wrapped her arms around herself. This was nothing but unfair. The injustice that the people of Kamar suffered had been a sore point for years. But now that Neera had been locked up, she felt anger burning in the pit of her stomach. And this kind of anger was dangerous. The prison cell was cold all around her, and she shivered, sitting up. She tried to stretch herself out, but it was almost painful. The cobbles weren't even. And somewhere, water dripped incessantly, driving Neera up the wall. She hugged her knees to her chest. She had to think. She had to keep a clear mind if she was going to survive at all. Today was it, the day she was going to have to fight for survival. It was the ultimate punishment. Prisoners were sent to fight for their lives. It was easier than having to look after them, to keep them alive. And Neera had done something punishable by death. She had stolen a gem for the sake of healing her mother. Her mother was dying and desperately needed help. But regardless, Neera had done the wrong thing for the right reasons. It was ironic that she would be killed for trying to save a life. But in Kamar, nothing was fair, nothing made sense, and you played the hand you were dealt. Neera was a hopeless, a slave from the slums. And there was no forgiveness for her kind. The only way she was going to get out of this was if she managed to win, to kill someone in the tournament of judgment and regain back her freedom. She just didn't know if she could do it. How could she kill someone? It was a joke to be forced to go to jail only to be turned into a murderer. Kill or be killed. What a mess. If Neera had known it was going to lead to this, she might have done things differently. Or maybe she would have done exactly the same thing. Because her mother was sick and still needed healing. And her life was horrible thanks to the royals who called the shots without knowing what they were doing. Really, Neera hadn't had a choice. And she resented the evil princes for the fate that was going to befall her. Both of them, because her life was never supposed to be like this. Kamar was a beautiful city. When the sun rose, casting golden rays across the horizon, the city glittered like jewels, drawing eyes to it from the horizon. Travelers were often beckoned to it, drawn by the wealth and prosperity. The city was an attraction, a tourist destination, a place of wonder and mystery, where visitors could talk about it for years after they visited because they tasted the delights of the season. Because they had been shown the beauty and grace of Kamar. The houses were rich and luxurious. The parties thrown by the royals were extravagant and meant to stun and impress, and visitors were invited to marvel at the riches and glory of a kingdom that had never fallen. But not all was as it may seem. There were dirty secrets behind every story of power and success. As with everything, there was a dark side to Kamar. And as luxurious as life was for the rich with the extravagance and pleasure they delight in, it was as grim and painful for the poor. However, they were kept from sight and forced to hide away in the shadows. They were made to work their fingers to the bone as slaves and fight for their survival on a daily basis. So the truth of Kamar, the infection that festered just beneath the surface, would forever remain a secret. Chapter 1. Good morning, Neera, Mr. Adib called from the door of his little house. Neera stopped on the narrow cobbled street and stepped over the stream of filthy water. She barely noticed the stench anymore. She smiled at the old man. His tan skin was like leather, wrinkled and withered through his years working in the sun, and he was bent over, crooked like a question mark. His dark hair had faded into a wise gray over the years. But his eyes were youthful, and there was nothing wrong with his mind. Mr. Adib was the healer in the slums, the man who took care of everyone who fell ill or was injured thanks to the guardians and their foul tempers. He did his best, working with herbal ointments and broths and doing what he could to match the magic stations and their healing powers, making up for the fact that the hopeless were never allowed to access those stations and find true healing. Privileges like healing or riches were only reserved for those who could afford it. "Good morning, Mr. Adib," Neera said with a smile. "How are you today?" "It never helps to complain, does it?" Neera shook her head. "Indeed, it never helped to complain." "I have something for you," Mr. Adib said and turned back into the little house, appearing almost immediately with a small satchel. Neera took it from him and opened it. The smell was strong, and she coughed. "It's for Vida," Mr. Adib said. "It won't help a lot, but it will take the edge off." "Thank you so much," Neera said, carefully closed the satchel again and hung it from her wrist with the drawstring. This was worth gold. Neera's mother, Vida, was very ill. She was dying. She needed painkillers, something to soothing her aching body, her worried mind. Mr. Adib knew what she needed, and he never asked for money in return for his favors, not from anyone. "I just wish I could do more," he said. "You're doing so much more than you know," Neera said. A lump rose in her throat. Despite how much Mr. Adib had been through in his life, such as torture by the guardians, among other things, he remained kind and caring. If only it were that easy to hold on to who you were. When things became dire, Neera wondered if she could keep a grip on the person she was. Would she lose everything and become hard like Arsalan? He was a boy her age, and he was cruel and bitter because of what the slums had done to them all. "Take care now," Mr. Adib said before turning back to his house. Neera nodded and headed to her little house. The houses in the slums all looked the same. The concrete walls were raw and cold, cracked in some places, and crooked. There were times, when the wind ripped through the narrow streets of the slums, that Neera hoped the house wouldn't fall apart, that the worst of the winter would be fighting the cold that burrowed its way into the cracks, and not worrying about finding a new home. When she walked in, her mother was still asleep. She was curled up on a pile of blankets in the corner where Neera and her mother both slept together. Her face was worried, her hands curled tightly into fists. Neera sighed and pulled a blanket over her mother. The house was spotless. Neera sighed. They had very little, but Vida insisted on keeping it perfect, and Neera hated that her mother still worked as hard as she did despite being so ill. She made a broth with the herbs Mr. Adib had given her and set the bowl next to the makeshift bed for her mother to drink when she woke up. It would help take the edge off, as Mr. Adib had said. It would be something, at least. Neera snuck out of the house again, quietly closing the door behind her. Hopefully, she would be in and out and back home again by the time her mother awoke. And her mother would be none the wiser, never knowing what Neera had done. This time, when she left the house, she was nervous. She walked the narrow roads as before, avoided the sewage, and greeted the people she crossed on her way. But now she was going to do something she had never done before. She was risking so much by even thinking about it, let alone following through. Neera wasn't allowed past the gate that separated the slums and the hopeless from the nobleman, not without her master's permission. And her master was out of town for the foreseeable future. Not that it made her a free agent. On the contrary, it meant Neera was limited to the slums if she wanted to move around, and her master only paid her half her wages while she wasn't moving around and running errands for him. Neera and her mother always suffered when her master left on a business trip of any kind. The problem was Neera had been cornered. There was nothing else that could be done. Her mother desperately needed help. The magic stations were too expensive and off-limits to the hopeless. And Mr. Adib could do nothing more than he already had. Neera had to take matters into her own hands, or she was going to lose her mother. And she couldn't afford to lose the one person she had left in this unforgiving world. She crept through the streets toward the palace. She used the back roads and kept her head down so that she looked like a slave on an errand. She prayed none of the guardians would ask her where she was headed, or for her scroll. The slaves were all required to carry a permission scroll from their masters, or they could be locked up for trespassing. Neera couldn't afford to be locked up now, not before she had even started fixing everything that was broken through a life that neither she nor her mother deserved. Finally, she was close enough to look up at the giant structure, built for the sake of pleasure alone. She was still a while away from the castle walls, but the houses were starting to fall away. She had to get to the palace without being seen, or she would never make it inside. She knew the guards were going to change at sunset. And the moment they did, when the sun sunk behind the horizon and the guardians left their post to be replaced by another set, she slipped in through the palace gates. For a moment, she was awestruck. The palace was magnificent, a building that was clearly built for luxury and grandeur. Movement caught her eye, and she slipped in through a side door. She didn't have to go far to find what she was looking for. The throne room was off to the side. When she popped her head through the door, she found the room empty. And before the set of thrones that stood majestically in the middle of the room was a table with gems and jewels on display. She looked them over, her breath catching in her throat. This was worth more money than Neera would ever see in her lifetime. She lifted an emerald and carefully slipped it into the satchel she brought with her. This would be enough. Neera did not want all the riches in the world. All she wanted was enough to afford some healing potion from the magic station at the gate. Once the gem was secure, she slipped out of the room again and out of the side door into the palace garden. It was getting darker, the rays of the sun slipping away as it sank further behind the horizon. It had almost been too easy. As soon as she left the palace, she would almost be home free. "You," someone suddenly shouted, and Neera froze. "You don't work here. Who are you?" Neera tried to decide if she was going to try and talk her way out of this, or if she would run. She looked over her shoulder. A guardian was staring at her from opposite the giant front doors that she hadn't used. The choice was simple. Run. Neera didn't hesitate. She ran. Suddenly, there was a huge commotion behind her, guardians shouting and the sound of feet following her. She heard swords being drawn, and she knew if she was caught now, she could die. She didn't try to stay hidden this time. She just ran through the main palace gate and onto the road. Everyone had stopped to stare at her, noblemen and their slaves alike. And the guardians were right behind her. Neera headed into the back roads, the alleys that ran behind the houses and joined everything up in a web of walkways that would conceal the slaves. She knew these roads better than the main roads, and she hoped the same was not true for the guardians. As soon as she headed into the alleyway, she knew the guardians knew them as well as she did. She ran through the buildings, but they were right on her heels. But the alleys had crates in them, washing lines and awnings, everything the inhabitants wanted to hide from the road. Neera ran past a stack of empty crates and yanked one of them so that the whole pile started tumbling across the alley as she ran, creating a block. The guardians had to climb over them or crash through them, and it bought her a bit of time. Her heart pounded loudly in her throat, and her legs were on fire. She wasn't unfit, but she hadn't had a lot to eat lately. She rather feed her mother so Vida could regain her strength, and Neera felt out of breath. But there was no time to stop and breathe. The guardians were catching up to her. She turned to the right, heading deeper into the backways and headed for a small construction site where they were repairing a broken wall. A ladder led to the roof and Neera climbed it. She moved fast, but going upward when the guardians ran toward her wasted precious time. She was on the last rung when a guardian yanked the ladder out from underneath her feet. Neera fell, arms flailing, grabbing at the edge of the building. Her body ran cold, blood draining from her face. By some miracle, her fingers gripped the edge of the building, and she hung from the side of it, her legs like jelly from fright. The night sky turned inky, and if she could get away in the darkness, it would change everything for her. Just a little bit more. But there was no time to waste. She squirmed, kicking her feet and hoisting herself up until she could get a good grip and roll onto the roof. As soon as she was up, she started running. The roofs weren't strong enough to hold her, but the walls on the sides of the flat roofs were, and she ran along them, moving as fast as she could. Below, the guardians followed her, looking up from the street as she ran. It wasn't too dark to see her shadow yet, and the torches that had been lit all around offered light, too. Neera couldn't afford to lose her balance on the narrow ledges she ran on. And she would make it happen. She would keep her balance. If she fell, nothing would matter anyway. She managed to move from one building to the next, the houses in front of her almost pressed together, they were so close. And then suddenly, they all stopped. The next house was too far for her to jump. And there was nowhere else to go. The guardians seemed to know it, too. They stopped at the bottom of the house, looking up at her, faces smug. Neera looked around, desperate to find a way out. She clutched the satchel with her fingers, making sure her treasure was still where it belonged. The house opposite was too far, but there were awnings on the side of it, material awnings, and the next road was filled with slaves moving toward the slums at the end of the day. If she could get to them, the guardians would have trouble seeing her in the darkness, telling her apart from the others. But it was a far jump, and she could risk injuring herself badly. But it was that or be thrown in jail. Neera turned around and walked to the far edge of the building. She turned around and took a deep breath, steeling herself, ignoring the guards down below and the fear that clutched at her throat. And then she ran, faster and faster, and as she reached the edge of the building, she threw herself into the air with a cry. Her hair flew around her head, and her body was light as a feather. But all too soon, gravity pulled her down, and her voice disappeared in terror. For a moment, it seemed like she was going to miss the awning altogether. This was it, Neera thought. If she didn't fall to her death, the guardians would ensure she wished she had. Thankfully, when she finally landed with a thud, she hit the awning and felt the material give under her weight, a ripping sound accompanying it. She crashed to the ground, her fall mostly broken, and stood up, dazed. There was no time. A little voice in the back of her mind screamed. Neera ran to the main thoroughfare the slaves used and disappeared into the crowd. By the time the guardians caught up, Neera was well disguised and on her way to safety. When Neera finally arrived home, it was dark. The torches outside lit up the narrow streets, and all the crooked little windows had light in them, with the hopeless returning home to spend time with their families. Despite the pain and suffering the hopeless experienced in the slums, they could always find a reason to smile, a reason to be together, and people who were there for each other. It was something the nobleman would never have, something all the money and even all the magic stations in the world could never afford. When Neera arrived at her own little home, there were no lights on in the windows. Her stomach dropped to her feet. What if something had happened? What if her mother hadn't made it, had passed in her sleep? The fact that this was a possibility at all terrified Neera. She didn't want to come home one day and know she was too late. Not now when she was so close. She ran her fingers over the satchel with the gem and took a deep breath before pushing open the door. "Mom," she called out. Neera, she heard her mom's voice from the corner, and she sighed a breath of relief. "I'm coming," she said and hurried through the dark room, finding matches and lighting the oil lamp next to their bed. The room flickered with the dim light from the dancing candle, and Neera studied her mom carefully to see if she looked worse than usual. But her mother had color in her cheeks, and her eyes were bright. Neera was also glad to see that the bowl of broth was empty. "Thank you, sweetheart," Vida said. "We need to make supper. Come to the kitchen, but sit." "I'll do it," Neera said. She helped her mother up, and together, they walked to the kitchen corner. Neera helped her mother into a chair before she started on supper, cutting a loaf of bread into thick slices and cutting up the salad ingredients she had bought that morning. The last of the meat they had went to her mother, who needed her strength. Neera would make do with salad and bread. She was stronger. "What did you do today?" Vida asked when they sat together at the table to eat. Neera thought about the palace, about the gem that was still in the satchel hanging from the hook where she had put the shawl she often wore. She wasn't going to tell her mom what she had done. Vida had raised Neera with a strong moral compass. No matter how bad things got, no matter how difficult life could be, you never stole from others. You didn't take what didn't belong to you. You played by the rules, and eventually, the universe would notice, and it would give back. But that had been when Vida had been healthy, when she hadn't been dying. If it were the other way around, Neera was sure her mother would have broken the rules for her, too. After all, her mother was the only person she had left. They had to stick together, the two of them. They had to look out for each other. "I didn't do much. I wandered around the slums, helping here and there. Until Mr. Nasirian returns, there isn't much else I can do." "He'll return soon," Vida said, referring to Neera's master. Neera nodded, but she wasn't so sure. Her master could stay away for weeks on end on his business trips, and when he was away, they only earned half their wages, which meant they suffered more than usual. "Tell me about that boy," Vida said, and her eyes glittered. "Salah." Neera crinkled her nose. "I don't know what you're talking about." Vida laughed, and Neera relished the sound. Since her mother had fallen ill, Neera had started paying attention to the small things. The chime of her mother's voice when she laughed, the smell of lavender on her hands after she helped Mrs. Yekta carry bushels of fresh herbs to the market, and the look in her eyes when she thought about the days when Neera's father had still been around. Because Neera didn't know how much longer she would have that. And the thought of losing her mother made her so sad. "What's wrong, my darling?" Vida asked, noticing Neera's mood. "Don't you like him anymore?" Oh, they were still talking about Salah. Vida thought Neera's sadness was about the boy. "I don't know," Neera said, honestly thinking about the boy who had grown up a few houses down the road. Who has time for love and affection in times like these? "Don't reject things that are natural, Neera," Vida reprimanded. "Our lives are hard enough as it is. We deserve happiness." Neera nodded, but she didn't agree. Who had time for love and romance when every day was a struggle to survive? And Salah was a wonderful person. Neera had once thought she could love him when she had been younger. But the truth was Neera wanted more. She couldn't settle for a life that was so dull, a life so painful. She needed more while Salah was happy to settle. Neera had no idea if she could make her life better, if she could find something different from what they had. She didn't know if she could change her fight. But she would try. Salah wouldn't even want to. "Let's just focus on getting you better, Mom," Neera said. "And let's enjoy our time together while Mr. Nasirian is away." When Neera's master was away, she spent as much time as possible with her mother. She knew Vida felt guilty for not being able to work anymore due to her illness, and Neera wished she could show her mother that it was all right. The only time Neera wasn't with her mother was when Vida needed to rest. Sometimes, that could last hours at a time. And then Neera would get edgy and feel the need to head out into the streets to get away from the confines of their four crooked walls. From the panic that her mother didn't have much time left, and the despair that came with knowing she couldn't do anything about it. After supper, Neera cleaned up, and then she helped Vida to their bed. Her mother was exhausted again, and it was worrying that she had so little energy. Neera pulled the covers over her mother and dropped a kiss on her hair. Tomorrow, she thought. Tomorrow she was going to take the gem to the magic station, get the potion for her mother, and heal her. Neera was terrified that there was no time left. She had nightmares that she would come home after work one day, or after walking around in the slums, to find Vida's lifeless body, and it would all be too late. When she was sure her mother was asleep and breathing steadily, Neera crept out of bed again and left the little house. She walked through the cobbled streets but headed in the opposite direction of the city center. The city walls were high, but they were broken and crumbled in many places. The side of the city no one saw but the hopeless. Neera had always come here with Salah to play when they were younger, and they would sneak through the cracks in the wall and head out into the field beyond. Their parents would always be furious. But it had been an escape. Even as children, when they hadn't been aware of how hard things could really be, and everything had felt like a dream when her mother colored her life with positive words, Neera and Salah had wanted to get away. Because the slums had always been awful. And Neera sought to get away now. She climbed the crumbled wall, slipped over a low patch, and walked through the knee-high grass that grew between the city and the forest. When she reached the edge of the trees, she stopped. The mountain lay beyond it, and she didn't dare go into the forest alone at night. It was dangerous even during the day, and she was a woman wandering alone. But she needed to get away from the city, and out here she could breathe. She looked up at the sky. The moon was almost full, crawling out from behind the mountain. It smiled down at her with its smooth cheeks, and Neera envied that it was so far removed from the world, so untouched by the hell that could rain for some. The stars were beautiful, too. They were scattered across the sky like a bowl of appended diamonds. When she was a child, Neera remembered thinking that if she had all those stars as wishes, she could change her whole life. Now, all she wanted was just a handful. Something to help her mother. Something to change her life. She closed her eyes and took a deep breath. If she believed in miracles, in something she could turn to that would make everything better, she would utter something like a prayer or a wish now for her mother, for her future. But from the start, Neera had been taught that if you wanted anything, you had to fight for it yourself. If you didn't make it happen, it wasn't going to happen at all. Maybe it was different for the noblemen, those who lived on the other side of the gate, who didn't have to worry about money or food from the moment they opened their eyes until the moment they closed them again. Life fell into their laps. But for people like Neera, it was a constant fight for survival. And just once, she wished for something that would help. Something to give her a break. Chapter 2. Neera walked through the narrow street like she always did. She was just another one of the hopeless, walking toward the gate like the rest of them. But her heart beat in her throat, and she felt like everyone could see the nerves on her face. "Morning, Neera." Mr. Adib called from his window. She lifted a hand to wave at him but hurried along. She didn't want to be stopped for small talk. She had somewhere she needed to be. The sooner she could get there and do what needed to be done, the better. "Neera," Mrs. Yekta called out. She stood in the road with a bushel of lavender in her arms. "How are you? How is your dear mother?" Neera didn't have time for small talk, but she didn't want to be rude. "She is doing as well as she can, given the circumstances," Neera said. Until Neera pulled off what she was on her way to do, she thought. Then everything would change. "Give her my best, dear. And let me know when I can come by for a visit." "Thank you, Mrs. Yekta," Neera said and hurried on. She hoped no one else would stop her. The hopeless were like a giant family, all of them standing together. They had each other's interests at heart. Pain and suffering had brought them together, and they shared in each other's sorrows as much as they shared in their joys. Neera made it through the rest of the slums without anyone else stopping her. Before she arrived at the gate, she turned into a small alleyway and dropped her bag on the floor. She worked quickly, yanking out the garments she had stolen weeks ago. She had been planning to do this for a long time, and finally, it had all fallen together. The garments were made of fine silk with golden embroidery, and when she pulled it over her ragged clothes, it felt uncomfortable and strange to wear something that was so beautiful over a body that was so dirty. Neera didn't have any way to know if she looked right, but she pulled the thin veil over her hair and clasped it in front of her chin as the ladies wore it. It hid most of her face, and that was what she'd been after. She hoped the garment was long enough that it wouldn't show her worn leather shoes. She hadn't been able to steal shoes as well. She stuffed the bag under a crate. If she was going to pretend to be noble, she couldn't have a bag with her. But she hung the satchel with the gem under the garments, squeezing it, feeling the weight of the gem in her palm through the thick material of the satchel. Nerves bunched in her stomach, and she felt like she was going to throw up. If she were caught, she would be thrown in jail without question. Not only was she a thief, but she had also stolen from the throne room. And she was about to pose as a noblewoman when she was nothing more than a slave. Her punishment would be severe. But the alternative, her mother dying, was worse than anything Neera could bear. So, she allowed herself 3 counts to pull herself together. She took a deep breath and stepped out of the alley. She had to hurry now to get to the gate before she was spotted by anyone. A noblewoman would never be in the slums, and the guardians at the gate wouldn't let her through no matter what she said. The hopeless wouldn't understand when they saw her. They would try to stop her from making a mistake, such as posing as someone in a position of power, and she wouldn't be able to tell them half of what she had done. The best would be to get to the gate and through it as soon as possible. Neera skipped through the last of the streets, hurrying, terrified she was going to be caught somehow. She breathed through her mouth. The stench in the streets was enough to make her gag, filthy water running into the streets from the houses because they had not been properly built and also because the inhabitants had nowhere else to go with their sewage. Finally, she arrived at the gate. The wall that surrounded the heart of Kamar stretched above the dilapidated buildings that surrounded her, and it seemed bigger than usual, terrifying with the weight of what she needed to do. But this was about her mother's health, her health. She had tried so many things. She had to try at least one more time. Always, one more time. The gate wasn't only the entrance into the part of the city where living was easier. It was the outskirts of the city, the playground of the privileged. And their one true luxury was magic stations. It was expensive to buy the magic, and the sources took long to replenish. Only the privileged were allowed to access such power. It was off limits for the hopeless. It kept them right where they were, and it maintained the balance. But Neera was desperate. Her mother was getting sicker. She didn't have long left, and no one was going to do anything for her. The healers had done what they could. Mr. Adib barely kept her going, although the poor man was trying everything he could. Neera's only hope now was the magic station. When she arrived at the gate, 2 guardians stood on either side of it, looking out at the slums. She recognized one of them. His name was Duran Nazer, and they all knew him. He was the cruelest of them all. His face was twisted in a scowl, his dark hair slicked back, and his jaw jutted out. Maybe he could have been a handsome man if it wasn't for the cruelty that shone from his eyes. The guardians wore the traditional yellow harem pants, leather shoes with the toes curled up, and leather waistcoats that showed off their muscles, their raw power, and their brute strength. Not only were they armed with the curved dagger that they almost wore as a badge of honor. They had anger on their faces, promises of pain in their eyes, and they also wore delusions of grandeur like a second skin. The guardians had been called so because they were the guardians of the city. At least, that was how it had been explained. But really, they were tyrants. They did the dirty work of the royals. They were armed with daggers and whips, and they used them whenever they thought someone deserved to be locked up. And to run from them was a death sentence. To be a guardian, you had to be heartless. And all of them were. Neera had to get past them without a note from her master, allowing her into the city. Otherwise, it would be assumed that she was on her way to a magic station, as the hopeless had no other interest in the city. And the hopeless were forbidden to use magic, lest they somehow rise above their station. But Neera didn't want to be better, get more out of life. She just didn't want to lose her mother. She pressed her hand against the satchel that hung from her shoulder again, using it as an anchor, hoping it would ground her. She felt like she was going to faint from nerves. She struggled to breathe, panic squeezing her chest. A commotion started on the other side of the gate when a hopeless staggered around, drunk and belligerent. It could not have come at a better time. It was as though he was heaven sent. The guardians both unsheathed their daggers and ran toward the drunk, ready to take action. Neera's heart beat in her throat when she made a run for the gate, unguarded for just a moment while the guardians' attention was distracted from their post. As soon as she was through, Neera pressed herself against the wall, making herself small and hoping to God that no one had seen her. As long as no human spotted her, she would be safe. When the coast was clear, and it didn't seem like anyone was after her, Neera took a deep breath, steeled herself, and moved away from the wall. She felt untethered, like a little boat lost at sea. She had to put on a face. She had to pretend to be something she wasn't. She had to carry confidence and arrogance on her shoulders, as if she was accustomed to being worshipped in one way or another. Now that she was through the gate and walking through the area where the privileged spent their time, Neera couldn't afford to look like she didn't belong. Ducking and hiding would draw attention to herself. The clothes she had stolen was to make her look like she belonged. At least, she hoped. She wasn't sure if she had taken exactly what she needed. But there was no turning back now, no changing her plan. It was all or nothing. And she walked with her head held high, with the confidence and arrogance of a privilege. Her hand rested lightly on the satchel. Nothing to see here. She was just another privilege going to a magic station to get her daily fill. But her fingers trembled, and Neera was barely breathing. When she arrived at the station, Neera stopped and stared in awe. She had seen the magic stations before when she passed on her errands for Mr. Nasirian, but they never ceased to catch her off guard. The station was nothing more than a booth with bottles and potions, but the magic in the bottles, and the processor that produced it in liquid form, all vibrated at a frequency that made it seem like everything shimmered, catching the light as it moved. And it produced a sound like something dancing in the wind. It wasn't only that, though. Neera could feel the magic in the air, feel it caress her skin and whisper promises in her ear as the breeze lifted her hair. She shivered. A queue of privileged led up to the station, all of them dressed in jewel-toned vestments and jewelry that shimmered in the sun. Neera wore no jewelry, nothing that would proclaim her riches. She hoped no one would notice. The privileged stood together in groups while they waited, talking, barely paying attention to the others. But a woman nearby looked at her with a frown, sizing Neera up. Despite wearing the right clothing, she felt exposed. Neera pushed her hands between the folds of the vestments she had stolen. She wore no expensive rings and bracelets. If anyone looked at her too closely, they would know she was an imposter. She hoped this woman would not take an interest of any kind or try to talk to her. A guardian stood close by, watching with a scowl on his face, his arms folded over his chest. She was worried about that. At least Duran was not on duty here, or she would have turned around and walked away to try another day. Duran was a guardian to contend with. She fought the urge to run her hands through her hair, making sure it was down and covering her neck. When she was home, she could tie it up and not worry that anyone would see the mark. But when she was in public, she preferred to have it concealed. The mark was black, a symbol Neera didn't understand. All she knew was that some reacted differently toward her when they saw it, and her mother had suggested she cover up the mark from a young age. The sun was high in the sky and burning down on Neera. Her skin was hot, and she sweated in the layers of clothing she wore, with her rags under the vestments she had stolen. Beads of sweat had formed on her hairline, and it was hot under the veil she wore. But she couldn't take it off for fear of being discovered as someone she wasn't. The woman who had stared before had already collected her magic and left. It felt like the queue continued on forever, and by the time Neera reached the front, it was well past midday. Neera was still careful, and she kept her eyes down and did nothing to draw attention to herself. But she was no longer nervous. Even with the guardian so close, her disguise must have worked. She had stood here for hours, and if they hadn't discovered her yet, they weren't likely to. Neera stepped up to the station and reached into her satchel. The station master offered her a wide grin. He wore a turquoise tunic with pink trim and a purple cape that made him look comical and out of place, but somehow it worked with everything else the magic station had to offer, and how surreal it was that Neera had managed to get this far. His black hair was combed to the same, and he wore a purple fez on his head with a golden tassel that moved from side to side as he waved his hands and shook his head. "What wonders can I offer you today?" the station master asked with flair, his arms wide. He waggled his eyebrows, and Neera swallowed a giggle. She had watched the other privileged as they had ordered their potions, and they had merely asked for what they wanted without flinching or responding to the station master's antic. She wanted to do the same, to fit in. She produced the gem, and a murmur rippled through the handful of people around her who saw it. The gem was like nothing she had ever seen. It was green and shimmering, but with a depth that seemed like it held another galaxy. It seemed even more magical than it had when she had picked it up in the throne room. But she hadn't had time to look at it then, and it had been in the dusk. Now that the sun shone on it, the gem seemed to come to life, and the colors danced around them as if it was glad to be admired by the bystanders. She handed it to the station master. He took the gem from her, but he held it as if it could shatter in his hands. His mouth was open, his eyes full of wonder. The gem was indeed rare, and no one here had seen anything like it, judging by their reactions. Neera had thought all the privileged handled precious stones like this. "Where did you get this?" the station master asked. Neera swallowed hard. What was she supposed to say? She was suddenly terrified that any answer would be the wrong answer. She looked for words but found none, opening her jaw without saying anything. She looked around. Everyone was watching her, waiting for a response. But she was pretending to be nobility, wasn't she? And they were all arrogant and entitled. And that could be her only saving grace. "Excuse me?" Neera asked, making her tone hard, hoping no one heard the underlying fear. "How dare you ask me such a thing? Is my money not good enough for you?" "Oh no, my lady, that is not what I meant," the station master stuttered. "I was just in awe of your wondrous riches. Forgive me." He bowed his head, and the tassel fell forward. Neera felt bad that she had been so rude. But she had to protect herself. "I need healing magic," she said without adding a please, even though she desperately wanted to be kind to the man. But she had to keep up her act if she was going to get away with this. It was already far more involved than she had hoped for. She glanced over her shoulder. The Guardian had his eyes on her and the transaction, too. But no, it was on the gem. He was as taken with it as everyone else was. And Neera understood why. She just prayed the gem wouldn't be recognized as a royal jewel. "Is that all you seek?" the station master asked. Neera nodded. Many were here for the other two kinds of magic that were available: power and fortune. But Neera only cared about her mother's well-being. Fortune and power would do nothing for her. She didn't care what her life would be like, even if the rest of it was spent in poverty and misery, as long as her mother was safe and well again. The station master nodded and turned to the shelves behind him. Neera was relieved, but she didn't want to believe she was home free, not until she was back home, and her mother was healthy. The station master turned back, his eyes a little guarded, his face reverent. Neera tried not to wince. He held out the small bottle, the potion that would save her mother's life. Neera reached out to take the bottle, but Duran Nazar was suddenly next to the magic station. His very presence was menacing, and his black eyes were trained on the gem that the station master held in his hand. "Stop," he commanded, and the station master drew back the potion. "Is something wrong?" he asked carefully. Duran looked at Neera, and she felt like his eyes burrowed into the very depths of her soul. And he knew. Neera was sure he knew what she had done. Her stomach turned to stone. "Where did you get this?" Duran asked, snatching the stone from the station master's hand. "It's a family heirloom," Neera stuttered, not daring to try the same arrogant routine she had used with the station master. After all, it could very well have been. "But not of your family," Duran said. "I know these stones. This belongs to the royal family." The crowd around Neera gasped. The station master looked flustered, like he was terrified he would somehow be implicated in this. "No, you are mistaken," Neera said, but fear clutched at her throat, and she had the awful sinking feeling in her gut that she had reached the end of the line. When she glanced at the people around her, they were all standing back, unsure. Even the privileged and nobility feared the Guardians. It was an eye-opener, but not one that was going to help her in this situation. "I'm never wrong," Duran said. "You're coming with me." He grabbed her wrist, and Neera cringed, pain shooting up her arm. His hands were large, his grip firm and crushing, and he didn't, for one moment, take her comfort into consideration. Duran was many things, but sympathetic wasn't one of them. He yanked Neera with him, away from the crowd. She tried to fight him, pulling against him, but it was as if she was nothing. Neera looked back over her shoulder at the potion that the station master put down again. The station master met her eyes, and he looked apologetic. But he wasn't going to do anything to help. No one was. "No, please," she begged. This was her last hope. This was her mother's last hope. Duran dragged her along through the streets of the gate and its suburbs. Neera had stopped fighting after a while, and now she just followed meekly. There was nothing else she could do. If she continued to fight, he would continue to hold on to her so she couldn't escape. She had to look like she was cooperating. At least, her face was still partly covered, and there was hope in that. If Duran didn't recognize her, and she managed to escape, she would be able to continue her life without punishment, and she could always try again. She didn't know how she would do that, but now she had to focus on getting away from Duran. She stilled herself, forcing herself to be calm. She couldn't be crippled by fear if she was going to do this. She needed a clear mind. Fear swirled in her stomach, and she felt sick. But if she gave in to the terror now, she would be lost. She had escaped the Guardians before, hadn't she? She had stolen the gem and gotten away with it. She could do it again. After a while, Duran loosened his grip. Neera hadn't fought for a while, and he wasn't so alert to her movements anymore. It was exactly what she had hoped for. Neera glanced up at him. His features were stark, his mouth set in a grimace as they marched ahead. She wondered what went on in his mind, what happened behind those eyes. Duran was known as the cruelest of all the Guardians. How must it feel to be hated and feared the way he was? But no, she would not have sympathy toward an animal like him. She needed to get away, and that was all she would focus on. When the palace loomed ahead, the prison block not far off, Neera knew she had run out of time. She had to get away before she was within the prison compound, or it would all be over. With a quick twist, Neera broke free from Duran's grip. His hands were large, but her wrist was thin, and she had used the element of surprise. Neera was as shocked as Duran that it had worked. He was stunned for just a second, and Neera took her chance. She ducked into an alley right away. "Hey!" Duran shouted, and he still sounded a little shocked or mortified that she had gotten away. "Alarm! Alarm!" He immediately followed, and he had righted himself, his voice angry. "Prisoner escape." Neera shuddered at the title as she ran. She wasn't a prisoner, and she wasn't even a thief, although she had stolen. She wasn't a bad person. She had been raised right by her mom, always doing the right thing despite the terrible hand life death them. But she had merely done what she'd needed to do. She'd only wanted to save her mother. She moved through the alley, slipping in and out between buildings. Behind her, the Guardians were shouting again, a group of them pursuing her. This time, though, they didn't know she was a hopeless. Not with the clothing she wore. "There!" a Guardian shouted. He had appeared out of nowhere. How had they gotten ahead of her so fast? Neera looked around, saw the Guardian, and started running. She didn't care if her veil fell off now or if the clothing ripped. She just needed to get away. The Guardians were right behind her. She ducked through openings, slipping between buildings where she knew she could. This was too soon after she had escaped from them the last time. Her lungs were burning, and she recognized the feeling of agony. She climbed over crates, splinters digging into her palms. She would work them out later with a needle. She slipped through an alley that only the hopeless used, making it harder for the Guardians to follow. Or at least, that was what she hoped. But judging by the sounds, they were close. They were on her heels, and terror chased her like a predator. If they caught her, her life would be over. She ran and ran until she spotted a group of hopeless walking to the gate. But if she joined them now, she would stand out in her clothing, and they wouldn't even allow her to walk with them. She couldn't join the privileged either, as the Guardians would find her in no time. Neera ducked around a corner and hoped to God that she was fast enough, that the Guardians wouldn't find her this very minute. She started yanking off the clothing, dropping it on the ground in piles until she was dressed like the ragged hopeless she really was. The Guardians had somehow not found her yet, and she came out of the alleyway again. The group of hopeless had continued on, and Neera had to jog to catch up to them. "Neera," Salah said. She hadn't realized he was a part of the group. "Are you okay? You're out of breath." The Guardians skidded into the alley, and the hopeless stopped. But the Guardians were looking for someone in jewel-tone garments, and Neera was again nothing more than a slave girl. The Guardians moved around them, looking for someone else. "Can we move faster?" Neera asked. If the Guardians found the clothes in the alley before she was gone, they would know who to look for, and she could still be caught. Salah looked back at the Guardians. Neera could see him putting two and two together. "What have you done?" he asked. "Nothing you wouldn't do in my shoes," Neera said. Salah hesitated for a moment, and Neera looked into the eyes of the boy she had grown up with. She hated the disappointment she saw in them. But he nodded and didn't ask her any questions. She was relieved. Salah would always have her back, no matter what. Even if he had no answers to his questions. Even if he thought she had done something terrible. Finally, she was sure she'd lost the Guardians. They were far enough away, almost at the gate, and the Guardians were covering a different part of the city. It had been a close call, but Neera was sure she was safe. Until she was home, she wouldn't let out the breath she felt like she was still holding. But it was better now. There was hope again. There was always hope, after all. Only when she was halfway into the slums and on her way back home did Neera finally feel safe. Salah still walked with her even though they had already passed his house. "Will you tell me if you're in trouble?" he asked. Neera nodded. She was lying. She was already in trouble. But even though Salah was a boy that she could never love the way her mother might want her to, he was one of her closest friends, and she didn't want to involve him. "You don't have to worry about me. Everything is all right." If she said it enough times, maybe she would start believing it. "You know I will always worry about you and Vida," Salah said. Neera nodded and hugged him. It felt good to hold on to another warm body for 2 seconds and not have to be so strong. But she had to walk this journey alone until she could save her mother. So she let go of him again. "I need to go home," she said. "My mom is waiting for me." "Take care, Neera," Salah said. Neera forced a smile and nodded. Salah turned back to his own house, and she watched as he navigated the puddles on the narrow walkway. When he looked over his shoulder one last time and waved, she returned it before turning around to go to their own little home. She tried to ignore the dragging feeling of despair and disappointment. But it was difficult to shake the fact that she had failed. Chapter 3. Night fell over the city, and the lamps came on in the homes one by one as families reunited after a long day's work. The hopeless had to buy the oil for their lamps, and it was expensive. Sometimes, when the going was tough, there wasn't always light to be had, or they had to make do with candles. It happened from time to time that they needed to live in the dark. Neera stood in front of the stove in their small kitchen, stirring the pot with a wooden spoon. It was a wood stove, and it served as a stove and a hearth to keep the small house warm. But in the heat of the summer, it was almost unbearable to cook with the heat already pressing from the outside like a giant hand. "Let me do it, sweetheart," her mother said from where she sat at the small table. Her voice was tired. Neera shook her head and looked at her mother. She had a blanket over her legs, and her frail body looked so small under the blanket. It was as if her mother was wilting away. Neera's heart broke for her mother. How was she going to help her now that her attempt to acquire some healing potion had failed so miserably? She felt like crying whenever she thought about it. "I've got this, Mom," she said. Neera turned back to the stove and closed her eyes for a moment. A pang of regret shot through her that she hadn't been able to get the potion, the magic that would heal her mother. And guilt followed right on its heels. She should have been better than that. She should have been smarter. The regret and guilt came with physical pain, a stabbing in her chest, and she clutched her shirt, pressing her knuckles against her sternum. Her mother was paying the price for her failure, and Neera couldn't stand the fact that because of her, her mother would be in pain for as long as it would take Neera to try again. What if Neera failed again? What if she couldn't pull it off before her mother passed? No. She wouldn't think like that. She had to be positive she could make it work, that she could find the answer so her mother would be better again and this nightmare would be over. A commotion sounded in the street, and Neera frowned, standing on her toes to look through the little window. It was nothing more than a hole in the wall, covered with a ragged curtain that she pushed to the side. She couldn't see anything. "What's going on out there?" her mother asked. "It's probably nothing but one of the hopeless looking for trouble," Neera said. In a world that was ruled by strict laws, where no one owned the life they lived, it was easy to fall into a rut and look for some kind of way to have a bit of fun. Or to drink your sorrows away until you lost yourself, too, even if you ended up in prison for it. The hopeless were arrested for all kinds of misdemeanors all the time as if they were criminals by default, and even the smallest mistake was enough to condemn them forever. Someone hammered against the door with a fist, and terror gripped Neera around the throat, making her body run cold. They were here for her. They had found her. She didn't know how, but she hadn't gotten away. "Neera?" her mother asked. Her eyes were filled with questions, her face as terrified as Neera felt, and somehow Vida knew they were here for her. Neera felt like she was disappointing her again and again. Neera was rooted to the spot. Before anyone could think of answering the door, it crashed open, and guardians flowed into the house, their harem pants bright in the dim light, scowls on their faces. They stormed the kitchen, and Duran walked in with an air of authority and menace. Neera wanted to run, but there was nowhere to go. And she wasn't going to leave her mother behind with these brutes, either. God knows what they would do to her. Duran grabbed Neera, painfully bending her arms behind her back and forcing her to her knees. "You'll have to learn the hard way that running gets you in a hell of a lot more trouble than admitting to your actions," Neera cried out. It felt like her arms were going to snap out of her sockets, and adrenaline pumped through her body, making her tremble. Her mother screamed. "You are under arrest by order of Prince Ezel," Duran said in a voice that was more authoritative than a moment before. "She has done nothing," Neera's mother cried. "You cannot do this. This is a home." They didn't respond to Vida's pleas. They ignored her while Duran bound Neera's hands with rope. "You're not getting away this time." Neera tried to figure out how she had been found out, how they had known it was her when her face had been hidden when she had gotten away. She had thought her identity would be a secret, at least. Neera was hoisted to her feet. Her wrists were bound uncomfortably tight, and she winced when Duran shoved her toward the door. "I'm so sorry," she said, looking at her mother, who had sunken into the chair and looked smaller than ever. Vida's face was twisted in a mask of worry and fear. It was so unfair that she had to see this, that she had to suffer this way after everything she had already been through. Neera regretted that this was how she had gotten caught. If only she hadn't gotten away in town. If only they had grabbed her there instead to save her mother from witnessing this. But Neera truly believed she had gotten away. When she walked into her home, she had believed she was finally safe. Did the neighbors hear the commotion? Would Salah know what was going on? No. Vida cried out as if she had decided she would not stand for this, after all. "Mom, don't," Neera started. Her mother would get hurt if she tried to stop the guardians from taking her away. The guardians didn't care about the hopeless. They wouldn't be gentle with her, and Vida was so frail already. Vida didn't stop. She didn't hold back. She started shouting at the guardians, panic overtaking her. A guardian stepped between Neera and her mother. "Silence," he rumbled. "This is a mistake." Neera's mother cried out again. "Please, Mom, no," Neera begged. She knew what was coming. Despite her pleas, her mother tried to come closer to Neera. The guardian grabbed her by the shoulder, and Vida cried out. "She's sick." Neera shouted, fighting against the ropes, trying to get to her mother. But Duran held on to her so she couldn't get closer. The other guardian unsheathed his dagger. He lifted it, and the blade glinted in the light. Neera stumbled and fell to her knees, tears running over her cheeks. She couldn't see her mother as the guardian's large body blocked her view. But she heard her mother's shouts turn to gasps and pleas for mercy. "Sit down and shut up," the guardian growled. "Don't touch her." Neera shouted. She would listen to the guardians and do whatever they wanted, but her mother wasn't to be harmed. She didn't do anything. The guardian took a step closer to Vida, like a mock charge, and Neera's stomach lurched. Vida was silent now, as she had been commanded. "Sit down," he ordered. Neera couldn't let this guardian dominate her mother and threaten to hurt her. It went against every grain in her being to stand idly by. She tried to get to her feet, yanked herself away from Duran, and managed to stand. She ran toward her mother, not thinking about anything other than getting to Vida, making sure she was safe. Before she could move very far, something hit her over the head, a blow so hard that the world was drowned in black. Someone, probably Duran, twisted her bound wrist so hard that pain shot into her neck and shoulders, and her body twisted to the side. She cried out, seeing stars after the blow, disoriented. She couldn't see anymore, only hear a scuffle, her mother's pleas. Neera's head started to spin, and she felt like she was going to throw up. She could fight the blackness, but the blow had been hard, and it had caused damage. She knew she could only hold on for so long. She tried to get to her mother one last time, but her body was heavy, uncooperative, and she tumbled to the floor. The last thing she heard was her mother's voice, still pleading, before it disappeared, too. When Neera opened her eyes again, a sharp pain shot into her temples, and she groaned. Her body ached when she moved, and she realized she was on a hard floor, the cobbles uneven under her ribs. She lay on her side and pushed up. When she looked around, her heart sank. Neera had never been caught for her stealing, and she had only heard stories about what the prisons were like in Kamar. But she knew it was where she was now. The walls and floor were all made from the same rugged cobbles, with nothing but a pile of straw in some of the corners, presumably to sleep on. Although where she had been dumped on the floor, there was no hay, and she was cold to the bone. She shivered. Shackles and chains were bolted to the wall, but they were all empty, and Neera was glad she wasn't in them, either. She shuddered to think what it had to be like to be hoisted up in those, with arms above her head and feet barred apart, not even able to curl into a ball against the chill. Absent-mindedly, she rubbed her hands over her wrists where the rope had bitten into her skin. And then, as if it only hit her now, she remembered what had happened when Duran and his guardians had come to her home. They had traumatized her mother, maybe even hurt her, and Neera hadn't been able to do anything about it. In fact, it had all been her fault. She should have been better, faster. She should have done everything differently. Should have, could have, would have. Her wrists hurt. Her struggle against the ropes had rubbed her skin raw. She had seen the thick ridges some slaves had around their wrists from being bound in earlier years before being allowed to return to society. And she started to understand how that could be. Neera shivered, unable to fight the cold. The prison cells were freezing, and the wind blew in through cracks somewhere, a draft that seemed never-ending. And the cobbles beneath her were freezing to the touch as if they had never seen the light of day. Perhaps they hadn't. Footsteps sounded outside, and Neera froze, listening. She had no idea what to expect, but if the door could open, maybe she could make a break for it. They hadn't shackled her. Maybe she could use that to her advantage, and when she was long gone, they could wish they had. A lock turned in the heavy wooden door, and Neera jumped to her feet, spinning around to face the door. Whatever was coming, she wanted to be ready. She needed to get around it and out to whatever lay beyond. She didn't know the prisons or how she would get out, but she had to try. The door opened slowly, but only a crack, and a man slipped through. He shut the door again almost immediately, as if he had known that she would try to make a run for it, as if he had done this before. But this was no ordinary man or a guardian of any type. Neera knew those well enough. This man wore cream vestments, pants, and a shirt that matched, with a wide belt wrapped around his waist. Neera wondered what it had to feel like to wear material that luxurious. She imagined it was like lying in a bath of milk. The man also wore a silk hat and shoes, and he had an attitude about him that suggested he believed he owned the world. He was handsome too, with a square jaw and a straight nose, an altogether regal face. His dark hair was combed back beneath his hat, and his skin was lighter than mine, the mark of a man who never worked in the sun. His face was also perfectly smooth. He did not laugh often, and Neera believed that no matter who this man was, he had not lived. His features were stark, and he had an air of importance about him. One of the princes. It had to be. Although Neera had never seen either of the princes, only heard of their existence. And she didn't know what the nobility would wear, either. But she was almost sure he was royalty. "I'm Prince Rai," he said. Bingo. Neera only admired the man in all his handsome glory for a moment before hatred replaced the awe of finally laying her eyes on one of the princes. He was the reason that she was locked in here. Well, not directly, since he hadn't ordered her arrest. But he was one of the princes who ruled the country, so he was one of the princes who had created and continued a world that impossible to survive in, impossible to get ahead. Impossible to find healing for a sick mother. It was his fault, his disgusting system, that had forced Neera to steal to save a life. And now she was here because she had been caught. But she should not be forced to bear the consequences of her actions, not if she had been forced to commit those actions in the first place. This man was responsible for her terrible life. And Neera was filled with sudden resentment so strong that she was coming undone at the seams. "I am already being treated like a criminal, so I might as well seal the deal." Neera cried out and attacked. The prince's eyes widened in surprise, but he wasn't caught off guard. Of course, someone like the prince would have had all kinds of training in self-defense. By the time Neera reached him, he had a sword drawn, although it wasn't the sword that drew Neera's attention. It was the hum of magic in the air. The royal family had been born with magic. Of course, the prince would have it too. But Neera was surprised by how easy it had been for the prince to access it. And, unexpectedly, she was immensely jealous. Because with power like that, she could heal her mother. It wasn't fair that a man with so much and want for nothing had the magic he didn't need, too. Despite the prince's magic and his sword, Neera continued her attack. She had only hesitated a moment. Neera could fight. It wasn't the first time she'd had to fend for herself, and she had so much anger and hatred geared toward the royal family that this was the perfect place to set it all free. The prince had taken her away from her family, had created a life for her that she hated, and because of the hell the hopeless went through, Neera's mother couldn't get better again. And the royals were all the same. If it hadn't been this prince who had come to see her, probably about the gem she had taken from the throne room, it would have been the other, Prince Ezel. Either way, it didn't matter who stood in front of her, who she was attacking. To her, they were one and the same. There was only a fraction of a second to breathe before the first contact was made, a blow struck by Neera. But the prince parried it with his left arm as if he had seen it coming from a mile away. When their bodies collided, Neera relied on what she had learned on the street to defend herself. But Prince Rai was adept at fighting. He had no doubt trained his whole life, and Neera knew there was no way she was going to win. The fighting she could handle, but she couldn't stand against the magic. She had never had access to magic as a hopeless, and the prince had been schooled in the art of his power. He had to have been. He was far too comfortable with the magic all around him for it to have been an accident. Despite the magic, Neera wasn't planning on giving up. They fought hard. Neera ducked the blade that Rai used to defend himself. He didn't seem to want to injure her. But she didn't care. It wasn't going to make him better in her eyes. Not when she knew what he really was. The magic didn't impress her either. Why was he using it at all if he was so careful with her? His careful manner was causing his downfall, Neera realized. She managed to get a blow to his stomach, and she kicked him on his shin so that he doubled over. The magic flared, and Neera gasped, feeling it wash over her like water as if she was suddenly submerged and couldn't breathe. It was just to throw her off, though. It wasn't to do her any harm. And she could fight it, she realized. If she didn't think about the air in her lungs, didn't panic about not breathing, she could continue fighting. He would not try to suffocate her forever. She could still win this fight if she acted fast. When she lifted her knee to knock him in the face, he was faster, and he quickly spun out. He grabbed her and twisted her so she couldn't move. She cried out. She had hoped the element of surprise would have been enough after winding him. But the prince had been trained for years and years, and his magic was still so thick in the air, it felt like she was submerged in fog. She tried to fight his grip, the power around her, but it was in vain. "I'll have your head for this," Prince Rai said, breathing hard. Despite how tired he was, he didn't let up on his grip, and Neera couldn't move. She was breathing hard, too. "Fine," Neera gasped, equally out of breath. She was being arrogant. But if he wanted to kill her, being humble wouldn't change his mind. And if he wasn't, well, she wanted him to know she didn't care about what he decided to do. The way he was holding her stopped her from taking in enough oxygen, and she felt lightheaded. Or maybe it was the magic that made it so hard to breathe. It was hard to say. "You'll just replace me with someone else," she added in a breathy voice. It was hard to sound arrogant when you couldn't breathe, but she was going to try her damnedest. "What do you care?" He held her with one hand, his grip such that she could not move, and she knew he lifted his sword with the other. She could imagine the blade, thin and shimmering in the dim lighting, ready to find its home in her neck. Her mother flashed before her. How would she be told the news? Would she survive it if she survived at all? Who would take care of her once Neera was gone? Neera hung her head in defeat. This was it, wasn't it? Her hair fell away from her neck and hung around her face like a curtain. How apt, she thought. Her face was hidden, so the prince wouldn't care who she was. And her neck was bare. She was ready for a beheading. But the prince sucked in his breath through his teeth and let her go. He stepped away from her as if she was infected. The sudden change made her lose her balance, and Neera fell on her hands and knees. She looked up at the prince, unsure and bewildered. The prince's eyes were so wide that she could see the whites in the dim light, and he was pointing at her. "The mark," Rai said, looking at her as if she had sprouted another head. "What of it?" Neera snapped. She lifted her hand to her neck, feeling self-conscious even though she had borne this mark since she was a child. She had no idea what was going on, why the mark was what had caused the prince to change his mind about killing her. Her mother had always told her to cover the mark. Neera still didn't understand the reason. But Prince Rai looked shocked, which confused her. After a moment, Prince Rai pulled himself together and shook his head, his face troubled. "I can't kill you," he said, still out of breath from their fighting. Or from fear or awe or whatever else Neera saw on his face. "Gee, thanks for that," Neera sneered. Now might not have been the time to be sarcastic, but it was better than standing there under scrutiny, looking like she had no idea what was going on. The prince turned around and walked back to the door, shaking his head. That was it. The fight was over. He was just leaving Neera behind as if nothing had happened at all. It angered her that he was acting this way. He had come to sell, looked her up, and now he was turning her down again? Rather leave me to rot in prison, it's much better, she added sarcastically. Perhaps it would have been better to keep her mouth shut, but she had always been quick with her tongue, and it had gotten her in trouble as many times as it had gotten her out of it. The prince turned to look at her and shook his head. She could not understand the look on his face. It was almost regretful, but it was out of place on the face of a prince. I can't stop them from hosting the games, and I can't save you from it. But you can fight, I'll give you that. I just hope it's enough. What games? Neera asked. The prince sighed. The tournament of judgment. I wish you the best of luck. He closed the door before Neera could respond. She stared at it long after Prince Rai had disappeared. She was shocked, with all the fight sucked out of her. What the hell had just happened? The prince had appeared out of nowhere, and he had fought her. And now she was alone again, spared thanks to a mark on her neck that meant nothing to her. She had heard of the tournament of judgment. It was a tournament where the prisoners were granted a chance to fight for their freedom, or die trying. It was a fight to the death, sometimes against other prisoners, sometimes against guards who had wronged the royals in one way or another. But the hopeless were poorly fed and not trained to fight. And the guards knew what they were doing. It was never fair, and it was basically a glorified public execution that the rest of Kamar were allowed to attend. Neera had never been to the games. Now that the prince mentioned she would fight in them, she wished she had gone at least once. Neera had never been able to stomach the idea of people being forced to fight to the death, like cockfighting, where the poor chickens were defenseless. Now she wished she had been there, so she knew what to expect, at least. So she could see what the prisoners did when they lost the fight. It had to be forced. They never won their freedom. Neera would rather have been killed in the cell, then. It seemed like a more honorable way to go. But Prince Rai had not killed her here, even though she had attacked him. That alone warranted a death sentence. Why had he spared her? Neera rubbed the back of her neck. She could feel the mark, slightly raised. Apparently, she had been born with it. No one knew what it meant. Her mother had told her, her whole life, that it was better to cover it up. People are afraid of what's different, she used to say. And we will just have to hide our little quirks for when we are alone together. Neera had asked her mother time and time again what the mark meant. We don't question the good Lord, my dear, she had said. Looking back, I was sure it only meant she had no idea, either. No one did, not one I had ever asked as a kid. Or the one or two before I had decided to stop trying altogether. Facts were no one had an idea. Except for Prince Rai, apparently. But he had left without saying anything else, walking away from the fight as if it had not happened. And his resigned attitude only served to scare Neera more. Tomorrow, Neera was going to partake in the tournament of judgment. The thought left her body cold. What if she died without ever finding out what the mark meant? God, what if she died, period? Her mother could not stay behind, and it would shatter her if something were to happen to Neera. Especially since Neera had brought this upon herself. No, she had to survive. Not only because she was too young to die, but because she had to take care of her mother. And now that it was clear the mark on her neck meant something, she had to find out what it was. Maybe it could be her salvation, an answer, a way out of the hell that was her life. For that, she had to be alive. Neera walked to the pile of straw in the corner and sat down, slowly, painfully. Her body ached in places where Prince Rai had hit her a few times. It would leave bruises. She already had enough of those in her life to know what it felt like before they showed. He could have killed her right away. He hadn't, but he had the capacity to. They both did. The princes had been raised in privilege and with the ability to take lives as they saw fit. But they were not connected to the outside world and did not understand the suffering of the hopeless, of the very people who served them, which only turned them into tyrants. It wouldn't matter who eventually ascended the throne if both princes were so disconnected from their people. Nothing was going to change for the hopeless, even if Kamar was under a new rule. Neera just had to stay alive to make sure her mother was safe. Despite her bitterness, Neera thought of Prince Rai. He was a tyrant, as was his brother, she was sure. But something about him had seemed different from what she had expected. She didn't know what it was, not that it made a difference. Her life was still difficult. It would always be. They were still poor, and her mother was still sick. If Rai was a good man, it made no difference to her. She was still going to the tournament of judgment, so sparing her hadn't done much. And even though she was determined to stay alive, who knew if it was even possible? Fear and uncertainty took hold of her again, and she felt cold. Shivering, she wrapped her arms around herself. She didn't know of any prisoners who had fought and won their freedom. So it didn't matter what was going on out there, who the prince really was, or the fact that he had spared her life. She had to make her own way out of here. She had to win her own life back. And only then would she be able to find out what the mark meant. She ran her fingers over her neck. She could feel the mark, only slightly thicker under her fingers than the rest of her skin. But it was there. Maybe, just maybe, she would be able to use the mark and whatever it meant to get a potion for her mother. Whatever it took to save the one woman she had left in her life. It was a different angle than before, but it was worth a try. Everything was worth a try if it meant she would end up saving her mother. It was as good a reason to stay alive as any. Chapter 4. When Neera opened her eyes, she could already hear the crowds outside. The privileged were gathered in the arena that lay before the palace, ready to watch the prisoners fight for the right to win their freedom. And fail every single time. Neera's stomach was twisted in a fist of nerves. How had it come to this? She had always been so careful, making sure she wasn't caught, making sure she would always go home to her mother. But this time, she had taken desperate measures to help her mama. And it had blown up in her face. She would be forced to fight another prisoner in the tournament of judgment, and the chances she would go home were slim to none. No, she told herself. She wasn't going to think that way. She had to stay positive and believe she had what it took to save herself, even if it had never happened before. The big wooden door swung open, and a guardian stood in front of her. "Come," he commanded, holding out the cuffs. Neera hated that she had to be cuffed again. She wouldn't think of running. Not now. But would she, though? Maybe she would have. But there was no chance to escape. She would have to walk through the streets of the city, let everyone look at her, and see her shame. And there was nothing she could do about it. The only thing she could thank the stars for was that her mother would be too sick to come out and see this. It wasn't something she was proud of, but for the first time, Neera was glad for these small little things. Before leaving for the arena in a large bus, Neera joined all the other prisoners. She looked at them, terrified of what might come. They were all so much bigger than her, stronger than her. And when they looked at her, there was hatred in their eyes. They were all out to survive. None of them wanted to die. And it meant they were all willing to kill. With a pang, Neera realized that if she were going to win, if she were to stay alive, she would have to kill someone else. Would she be able to do that? There wasn't much time to think. They were all packed into the bus so tightly that it was uncomfortable, pressed up against each other. Neera was surrounded by the stench of sweaty bodies that hadn't been washed in months, and hatred that had a smell of its own. The bus rumbled to the arena, and they were offloaded into a waiting area where they would be taken from, 2 by 2. Each survivor would go through to the next round until only one was left standing. That was how it had been explained to them. Neera was shocked. She had thought that somehow there would be more of chance. There had to be more than 40 prisoners here, and only one would end up winning their freedom. The rest would die. It made no sense. Where was the justice in that? But then again, it was called the Tournament of Judgment, not justice. And there was nothing fair about life in Kamar, not if you weren't born into the right kind of life. Soon enough, the fighting started. The first 2 prisoners were called out. Neera was terrified. She had been so confident until now, but she was sure it wasn't going to happen. She wasn't going to survive this. She stayed toward the back of the group, trying to go into the arena as late as possible. She eyed the other prisoners and hoped she didn't get someone who was stronger than her or so much bigger that she didn't stand a chance. When it was finally her turn, Neera felt like she was going to faint. How was she going to be able to kill someone? How would she ever be able to justify her freedom that way if she knew what she had done? They were all just trying to survive. She didn't think the others deserved to be there any more than she did. And just because they were fighting for survival didn't make it right. How could they justify locking up the hopeless for the smallest things by turning them into murderers to win back their freedom? Neera was paired up with the last of the prisoners, and she felt sick to her stomach. She looked around but saw no other prisoners. Was she the only one left? And what would that mean for her? "You're with me, Duran," the leader of the Guardians said. He stepped toward her. "What? No prisoners left means we get to draw straws for who fights. It's your lucky day. It will be over quickly." Neera shivered and looked up at Duran. He was the biggest man she had ever seen, even bigger now that she knew she would have to face him. His eyes were lifeless, and Neera knew he wouldn't think twice about killing her. But maybe that was okay. Maybe if she had had to fight a prisoner, she would have tried to win, to get it over with. But this was a no-brainer. Neera wasn't going to walk away from this. They walked into the arena, and the sun was blinding. It was already noon as it had taken so long to work through the others. Blood colored the sand under her feet, and it made her sick to think about how so many people had died here. When she glanced toward the colorful stand that housed the thrones, she saw Prince Ezel. He watched them with glee, ready to enjoy her death. It was awful. She turned to face Duran. He sunk into a battle stance as if she was going to be able to do this at all. As if she would be able to fight him. He had a smug smile on his face. "For what it's worth," Neera said, squaring her shoulders. "I didn't do what I did for myself. And if I have to die, I'll know it was essentially a selfless act." Duran snorted. "I don't care. I have a job to do, and you're it." Neera wanted to say something, to reason her way out of it. But Duran was just short of an animal, and bloodlust drove him. He lifted his hand and brought it down on her, and the fight began. Neera knows how to fight. She had been taught at a young age. The hopeless could all fend for themselves, which probably was why they had created the Tournament of Judgment in the first place. But Duran was so much bigger, so much stronger, and he was heartless. He didn't care about her. And no matter how hard Neera fought, she wasn't going to make it. It was easy to tell right off the bat. The blows rained down on her neck and face, and Neera covered her head, sinking to the ground to escape them. When they stopped, and she tried to get a blow or a kick in, something hit her in the kidneys. Pain exploded throughout her body, and she cried out, seeing stars. She blindly punched upward and hit Duran in the groin. It was a lucky shot, but even the biggest man had a weakness, and he doubled over. Neera took the chance and brought her knee up into his face. She winced when she heard the crack. But Duran was bigger and stronger than anyone she had ever fought before, and despite her advances, he straightened up and came at her again. And this time, death was written all over his face. His bloody nose and chin only offset the rage in his eyes. The crowds changed from cheering to gasping at the same time that Neera felt the ground tremble beneath her feet. She was too busy trying not to get killed by the Guardian in front of her to pay much attention to her surroundings, but she was sure it meant impending death. Suddenly, a white horse charged between them, and Neera fell backward. The horse rearer blocked Duran from getting to her. The rider was cloaked in black, and she couldn't see his face. But he leaned down to her when the horse was on all fours and held out his hand. She noticed strong bare arms, and his hands were large. "Come," he said. Neera took his hand and let him pull her up onto the horse behind him. Because even though he was a hooded stranger and none of this made any sense anymore, anything had to be better than death at the hands of the worst guardian in the world, or having to kill him if she even managed that at all. As soon as Neera was on the back of the horse, she wrapped her arms around the man's body and felt his muscles and strength. The horse reared up again, and she held on for dear life. In mere seconds, it leaped forward, and they charged out of the arena. When Neera looked back, she saw Duran on the floor, looking stunned, and Prince Ezel, who was on his feet, furiously screaming after them. But they were galloping away, and she was still alive. She also hadn't killed anyone. As soon as they were clear of the arena, the cloaked savior turned the horse, and they clattered through the streets. Cars and bikes scattered around them. Riding a horse in the city was outdated, but it seemed so much easier to get around. Not long after, they were finally clear of Kamar, and the horse galloped toward the forest beyond. Once they were well into the trees, the rider pulled the horse to a stop for the first time, and Neera slid off first. "Who are you?" she demanded. The adrenaline of their escape had worn off, and she was starting to fear what, or rather who, was in front of her. "That's no way to talk to your savior. And your prince." The man pulled off his cloak and revealed that it was Prince Rai. "Oh no," Neera groaned. "I would think you'd be more grateful after I saved you," Rai said. Neera shook her head. "I didn't need your help. That's not what it looked like to me." He was right, of course. She'd needed his help desperately. But she didn't want to admit that to him or to herself. He was a prince, a royal, and they were the ones responsible for the hell her life had become, for her mother's illness that would never be cured, and for the death that she had nearly suffered. "What do you want with me?" Neera asked. Why wouldn't he just leave her alone? "Do you know the purpose of the tournament?" Rai asked. Neera rolled her eyes. "To kill off all the prisoners so that your cells remain empty for more." Rai took a deep breath and blew it out slowly as if her statement was hurtful. "It's to find the chosen one. The one with the mark." Neera started lifting her hand to her neck, but stopped herself. "Yeah, you have the mark," Rai said, seeing her gesture. "Which makes you the chosen one. What does that mean?" Neera asked. "It's just a birthmark." Rai shook his head. "You know that's not all it is. You may not know what it means, but you know it's more than that." He was right, but Neera didn't want to admit to it. She wanted to be in control of the situation. Rai might have saved her, but he was still a royal, and they were responsible for the difficult life Neera and her mother had to lead, which had driven her to steal and ultimately get locked up. "I don't think I care," Neera finally said. "It's nothing." Neera started walking into the trees. She didn't know where she was going. She doubted she could go back to Kamar after escaping certain death which was intended for her. But she didn't want to stay with the prince a moment longer either. And if it meant she had to wander around in the woods forever, then damn it, so be it. She would find her way back home to her mother and help her somehow. She just didn't know exactly how she would do that yet. Wait, Rai called after her. Let me explain. But Neera kept walking. Please, he said. It's about magic, the type of magic no one can wield because it's so strong. Neera stopped in her tracks. Had he said magic? Chapter 5. What magic? Neera asked. She slowly turned around and looked at Rai. She was suspicious of him and was sure he was only trying to get her to stay. But it was working. What do you think my brother is after all this time? Rai asked. Neera shook her head. How am I supposed to know? The hopeless only do as they are told. They are not allowed to know about anything else in life anyway. When Neera said it, a look crossed Rai's face that looked almost like regret. But Neera wasn't going to accept it. She wasn't going to believe Rai cared at all. The royals never did. There is a most formidable magic out there, a magic more powerful than anything we have ever seen before. Neera narrowed her eyes and stepped closer to Rai. She should leave, she knew that. It was her chance to get away. But she was curious about the story. She had only ever known about the magic stations, and she couldn't imagine more powerful magic existing somewhere else. What does it do? Neera asked. She desperately wanted to cure her mother, and if there was even the slightest chance. Rai ran his hand through his dark hair. It makes the wielder the master of the universe. It sounded too good to be true. And in Neera's experience, if it sounded too good to be true, it probably was. Nothing in life was this good, and she was sure it was a trap. Then why hasn't your brother gone for it yet? Neera asked. Prince Ailing was everything Neera thought the royals to be. The fact that Prince Rai seemed different had come as a surprise. Because he does not bear the mark. He cannot get to it. He is not the chosen one. The only person who can get to it is you. Why? Neera asked. None of this makes any sense. Rai nodded. I know it sounds like a trap. But the truth is, many have tried and failed. Those who go to find the magic don't return. Neera thought about it for a moment. She knew what Rai was asking. He wanted her to be the one to retrieve the magic. But what would that do for her? The royals would just take the magic soon as she retrieved it, anyway. And she didn't care about anything else than getting back to her mother. She wanted to see her mother again, to make sure the guardians hadn't harmed her when they had knocked Neera unconscious. I'm sorry, but I'm not the person you're looking for. I don't want all-powerful magic. I just want to go home. Imagine what you would be able to do with that magic, Rai said. Neera shook her head. Imagining a better future is nothing but a curse. Because for us, none of our dreams come true. I am not going to fall into that trap, and I am not going to go for something that won't do anything for me. I just want my mom safe. Because your brother will hurt her if he hasn't already. Rai looked concerned. I have heard about your mother, and I'm sorry. But I can promise you now that Ailing wants nothing more than to wield the magic himself. He will not even think about your family again. Well, he can go and fetch it himself, Neera said. Rai shook his head, and when Neera turned to walk away, he stepped forward and put his hand on her arm. Neera glared at him, but she didn't yank her arm away. Rai's hand was warm through the material on her arm, and the look on his face was pleading. It's not just about the magic and what my brother might do with it, Rai said. The demon protects the magic. And my brother has tried a couple of times, sending people to do his work for him. This time, if someone tries again, a lot of people are going to die. Including your family. How would it be any different if I go and retrieve the magic? Neera asked. Because you are the chosen one. The demon won't attack you. You will be able to retrieve the magic without the demon escaping, and you'll save a lot of people, Neera. Neera felt like she was being pulled into a trap. How was she supposed to help this prince when the royals were the very people who had messed up her life in the first place? The prince seemed so sincere, worrying about the people, and she couldn't help but think he really did care. Still, Neera was torn. "Tell me about the demon," she eventually said. Maybe if she knew a little more about what was going on, she would be able to make up her mind without feeling torn. Neera hated that despite everything the royals had done to her, she still wanted to do the right thing. Curse her conscience. It happened for the first time a couple of years ago when my brother learned about the magic. He searched day and night until he found the location. I followed him that night and found him at the foot of the mountain. My brother had tried to take the magic without being the chosen one, and I saw how the demon came out of the mountain and started killing the guardians left and right. Ezel was the only one who escaped, and he had narrowly gotten away with his life. The demon would have killed Ezel. Then why didn't it? Neera asked. Rai shook his head. I don't know. It vanished suddenly, sparing my brother. I believe the demon showed up because the magic was being taken by someone who didn't bear the mark. I want to stop it from happening again, and I want to make sure the demon doesn't kill anymore. I can't bear to see innocent lives lost. Neera didn't know what to make of the story. She knew Prince Rai had to be evil, just like his brother. All the royals were. But as she listened to his story, it sounded like he cared about the people in his kingdom. But if he cared that much, why was everything so bad for the hopeless? Why was nothing being done? Neera opened her mouth to speak, but before she could say anything, thunder rumbled above them. Or rather, around them. It only took Neera a moment to realize it wasn't the thunder she was hearing, but the rumbling of horses' hooves. And it sounded like a lot of them. Ezel found us. Rai shouted just as the thought dawned on Neera. Come, he won't hesitate to kill you, even if I show him the mark. Neera asked. You don't want to do that, Rai said, shaking his head. He pulled himself up onto his horse. My brother is just going to use you to get the magic, and then he is going to kill you anyway. Come. Just like before, Rai held out his hand, and Neera didn't hesitate this time. Rai hoisted her onto the back of the horse with a power that left Neera flustered, and she hastily wrapped her arms around his waist. Rai kicked the force into motion, and they sprinted through the trees. Ezel's guardians were right behind them. When Neera looked over her shoulder, she could see them between the trees, weaving around the trunks with ease, getting closer and closer. Duran was leading the group. Of course he was. Can't you go any faster? Neera asked. I'm giving it everything I have, but it's just a horse. Neera knew full well that it was just an animal. It was why everything was automated now. It made everything so much easier to have technology involved. But horses still had their merits. If they didn't, the princes wouldn't be using them, and the guardians wouldn't still be on horseback, too. Suddenly, guardians appeared in the trees ahead of them, cutting them off. Rai pulled on his horse's reins, and the animal reared. Neera hadn't been ready, and she tumbled backward off the horse, landing on the ground with a thud. One of the guardians drew his dagger and slashed at the horse. The animal neighed in fright and tried to get out of the way. In the process, Rai fell off too. He landed close to Neera on the ground. The guardians surrounded them. I order you to stand down, Rai said, standing up. In the name of the prince. The guardians looked unsure, but Duran laughed. He was ugly, the scars on his face shifting when his face split into a grin, and Neera realized how much bigger he was compared to the others. I'm sorry, my liege, he said, although he sounded like he was mocking when he did. Our orders come from Prince Ezel. And we are not to bring you back alive. Rai looked surprised. Neera, on the other hand, was shocked. She hadn't ever thought the two princes would do something like this to each other. And apparently, judging by the look on Rai's face, neither did he. And suddenly, everything was thrown into chaos. Rai launched forward, hitting the closest guardian in his face. The guardian staggered and tumbled to the ground. Rai grabbed the dagger and a sword that hung on the guardian's other hip, drawing them. He passed the dagger to Neera so she could defend herself, and he dropped into battle stance with the sword held straight in front of him. The guardians all attacked at once, and Rai launched forward. He was not afraid of a fight, it seemed. And he was doing very well, too. Neera watched as he defeated the guardians one by one, winding them so they could not continue fighting unless they insisted on pushing through. In which case, it was clear that Rai was willing to take every step necessary. Neera was surprised. Twice, one of the guardians came toward her, but Rai jumped in front of her and protected her, fighting for her. She had never been protected like this, and Neera was starting to wonder if Rai was someone she could trust, after all. He was risking his life to protect her. But maybe it was solely because of the mark on her neck. And because Rai needed her to get to the magic. Even though it was possible, Neera didn't really think this was what was happening. Rai seemed to care too much about who she was as a person as well, and not only about the mark she carried on her neck. Before long, the guardians retreated. Rai was in the clearing, breathing hard, his horse only a few feet away. Neera looked around, wondering why Duran had given the order to retreat. It made no sense. But the danger was over for the moment, and Neera was relieved. "Thank you," Neera said in a small voice. "Don't mention it," Rai said, offering her a weak smile. "I understand if you prefer not to be involved with this. Clearly, it would mean risking your life, and that's not something I would ever ask anyone to do. I don't believe you'll be in danger from the demon itself, but my brother has now decided that you and I have to die. And I will understand if you would rather turn your back on this. I won't force you to do anything you don't want to." Neera was surprised. She hadn't expected Rai to be like this. At first, he fought for her freedom, and he had saved her, and now he was allowing her free will when she had been born into slavery. "I'll go with you to the mountain," Neera said. It was Rai's turn to look surprised. "Really?" he asked. Neera nodded. There was nothing else to say about it. She wanted to help Rai, to return the favor for keeping her alive. Not once, but 3 times. Rai was a prince, a royal. And they were not to be trusted. Neera had been taught this her whole life. But maybe she had been wrong about him. Maybe her parents and all the other hopeless who had told her the stories about the privileged and the royals hadn't known what they were talking about. Chapter 6. After the fight, Neera realized Rai had been injured. When he wanted to hoist himself back onto his horse to head toward the mountain, he winced. Neera spotted blood on his sleeve and shook her head. "Let me look at that," she said. She marveled at the fact that Rai hadn't said anything. In the slums, the hopeless were very quick to point out when something was wrong because they might be able to bargain the day off with their injuries or illnesses. Neera had always thought the royals could do whatever they wanted, and she had imagined that if the prince were to be injured, the world would come to a standstill. "It's nothing," Rai said, shrugging it off. Neera insisted and rolled up his sleeve, inspecting the wound. One of the guardians must have caught him with their sword or dagger. It wasn't a very deep cut, although it had bled considerably. But it was starting to clot, and the bleeding had slowed down. "You will survive this," Neera said with a nod. "I don't think you need medical attention." Rai shook his head. "No, it's better if we head toward the mountain immediately. My brother will not rest, And I know he is set on unlocking the magic as soon as possible. Neera nodded, and they mounted the horse, with Rai in the saddle and Neera behind him as before. They rode away from the city, the glittering buildings behind them, and headed toward the purple mountains in the distance. I thought you and your brother would be very close, Neera said after they had ridden in silence for a while. Everyone seems to think we are cut from the same cloth, Rai said. But they could not be more wrong. Ezel and I are very different from each other, and I don't agree with who he is. He seems to be very cruel, where you are compassionate. Neera hadn't meant to say it out loud, but when it was out in the opening, she didn't regret it. Because it was exactly what she thought. Rai and Ezel had always been the same person in her mind, but it was starting to become clear that they weren't the same at all. When Neera was growing up, she had been taught that the royals were the people to fear. And she had done so for many years. But Rai was just another person. Someone who wanted to help. Who will be king? Neera asked. Until now, a king had not been crowned. Everyone was waiting for one of the princes to ascend the throne, but years had passed, and nothing had happened. It's impossible to say at this point, Rai said. My brother would like nothing more than to rule the kingdom, but I don't think he will be a good king. He won't be just, and he will only make things worse. Neera shook her head. You don't understand what you're saying, she said. Rai looked over his shoulder at her. Why? Because you think you know what it means if something gets worse in the city, but you have no idea how difficult it can be. You have no idea what conditions we live in. Rai nodded. We have never been taken to the slums, I'll admit. I only know what is reported by the guardians. And I know they may be corrupted by my brother. So, tell me. After riding a while longer, the horse became tired, and Rai and Neera continued on foot, leading the noble steed. We live a life that does not belong to us, Neera said. We are slaves, and our fate is sealed from the day we are born. My mother is very ill, and she will never be able to get better again because we have no access to the magic stations. And any medicine is too expensive. We are forced to steal just to survive. Rai frowned. That can't be right. Can't it? How else are we to survive? The prisoners that fill your cells are put there by your guardians, but they are also created by the rules in your city. Rai was visibly upset. You cannot accuse me of what other people do. We all have choices. Do we? Neera asked. She thought back to every time she had stolen from the merchants at the gate. She thought about the gem she had taken from Prince Ezel. She thought about all the time she had been turned into a thief because she didn't have any other choice. Rai didn't answer her. They walked in silence for a while with the prince deep in thought. Neera wondered what was going on in his mind. Could he ever really understand what was going on beneath his nose? Will things ever change if he were to be crowned king instead of his brother? It seemed like a wonderful thing to hope for, but as a hopeless, Neera knew it was a dangerous thing to hold on to. The problem is, your life is always so glamorous. You can never imagine what it's like to live in conditions such as ours. The moment Neera said it, Rai snapped his head up to her and scowled. I understand your life is so different from mine, and that I have no idea what's really happening. Ezel and I grew up very sheltered by our father, who only wanted to show us the good side of the city and to continue to enforce his rules. But don't for one moment pretend to know what my life was like. You have as little insight about who I am as I do about who you are. Neera looked down at the pass in front of her feet. He was right. Neera knew just as little about the royals as they knew about the slums. In fact, the story was much the same, wasn't it? Neera had been raised with a view of the royals without ever being privy to what their life was really like. Just as it had been with Rai. So tell me, what was it like? Neera asked. What was it like growing up? Rai turned toward her. You would think that because we have so many riches, our lives were very easy. But it was difficult from the very first day. Neera struggled to believe it, but she was willing to be open about Rai's version of his life as he had been about hers. It was the only way to find out about each other, to know what their lives were really like. Neera couldn't keep falling back on her image of the royals, instilled by generations of slaves. My father, the former king, Rai continued, was a very hard man. Neera nodded. She had only been a child when the king died, but she knew the hopeless had never known such poverty as during the reign of the former king. After his death, when the councillors had taken over in lieu of the king until the princes were old enough to rule, things had become easier for the hopeless. It hadn't become anything worth calling a proper life, but there had been darker times. There was never room for error in my life, Rai said, still speaking. My father would punish us for the smallest mistakes, teaching us that only perfection was acceptable. We were taught to fear him, and my father was never a man we could turn to for guidance or companionship. And I don't know any other way, but I believe it's not supposed to be like that. Neera shook her head. Her own father died when she was very young, so she never had him in her life as someone she remembered. But she saw what her friends' fathers were like, and she knew what Rai had as an example growing up was not what it should have been. It made a lot more sense why he looked at the wall the way he did. Perhaps that would be an excuse for Ezel, too. Although, Neera wasn't willing to give the cruel prince the benefit of the doubt. I am sorry, Neera said when Rai had finished. For what? Assuming I know who you are. And for attacking you in the prison cell. Rai laughed. You gave me a run for my money. But I understand it, and there are no hard feelings. Thank you for listening. Neera nodded and glanced at Rai. She looked at him and saw a man, not a prince who would dictate her fate. And he was a handsome man. He had a square jawline, a nose straight as an arrow, and eyes that were drowning deep. His olive skin was smooth, and his dark hair was swept to the side, making him look dashing and handsome. When Rai glanced up, Neera felt silly for staring. But Rai offered her a smile, and something passed between them. Neera had never felt like this around someone before. And it was a wonderful feeling, warmth flowing through her body and the thrill of acceptance. It intrigued her. We have to tread lightly, Rai said, pointing at the road ahead. It was scattered with boulders and rocks, making the road a lot more difficult to travel. They were at the foot of the mountain, and the giant rock piles stretched above them, reaching above the clouds. How far do we need to climb? Neera asked. Rai pointed. A dark opening in the mountainside, a few yards up, gaped like a screaming mouth. That's the entrance, Rai said. We'll have to leave the horse here. Shivers traveled down Neera's spine. The wind picked up, and a chilly breeze brushed over her skin, giving her goosebumps. She didn't know what it was, but it was as if the sun had hidden behind the clouds, and everything about the atmosphere around them was changing. It was suddenly ominous, and the feeling of foreboding pushed against Neera's throat, threatening to choke her. We can't go up there, she said. She didn't know what she was feeling, but it felt like a warning they had to heed. We don't have a choice, Rai said. I promise it's not dangerous. Not if we follow the steps. Rai pointed to the rocks ahead of them, and Neera realized ragged steps had been roughly carved out of the stone leading up the mountain. It looked treacherous, but it was better than having to climb the rocks blindly. It's not the climb I'm worried about, Neera breathed. Because even though the path to the entrance seemed like the most dangerous thing Neera had ever seen, it was the feeling hanging in the air, thick and palpable, that scared her off. No one was allowed to go into that entrance. She didn't know how she knew, but she felt it in her gut. We have to turn around, Neera tried again. Something is very wrong. It's the demon, Rai said, and as soon as he said it, Neera shivered again. But as soon as he sees that you are here, that the chosen one has arrived, everything will change. Neera wasn't so sure about that. How could she know for sure the mark at the back of her neck was what would save her in a place that had death written all over it? Come, Rai said, holding out his hand. It was the third time he had done so since he saved her from the arena. Reluctantly, Neera took his hand. This time, the feeling of warmth and reassurance flowed from his hand to hers the moment their skins made contact, and Neera found the strength within herself to continue. She swallowed hard and nodded. Let's get this over and done with. Chapter 7. The stairs that had looked so treacherous from the bottom weren't nearly as dangerous as Neera thought. Rai let her go first, a real gentleman, and she felt a little more secure that he was right behind her. If it so happened that she slipped and fell, at least he would be there to catch her. Neera felt silly for thinking like that. She wasn't here to look for someone special, and it was definitely not the right thing to fall for the prince. But she couldn't help that he was the kind of person who took her completely by surprise. As they climbed higher and higher, Neera's thoughts were distracted from the man behind her to what she felt all around her. As they climbed, the magic grew. It was so strong in the air that it was like fog pressing against her skin. A couple of times, Neera rubbed her arms as if she could brush the magic away, and she always expected to find droplets left behind on her skin. But every time she looked, it was nothing more than her skin. The magic was palpable, but it was still magic and nothing she could touch. Finally, they reached the crevice. It was taller than it had looked from the foot of the mountain, and fear tugged at Neera's hair and clothes. We can still turn back, she said. A cold feeling slid down her spine. And then everyone will die, Rai said. He was looking down toward the foot of the mountain. Neera tried to see what he was looking at, but there was no movement between the trees, and Neera couldn't see anything that might put them in danger. Ezel will be here soon. Neera didn't think so. He hadn't even come to the forest with his guardians when he had sent them to attack Neera and Rai. She doubted he would come with his guardians to do the dirty work. Besides, the forest was quiet and peaceful beneath them. Come on, Rai said, taking Neera's hand. This time, he didn't hold his hand out but took hold of hers and gently led her to the crevice. He walked ahead of her, and Neera was again relieved. She didn't want to go into the darkness. When they passed through the entrance, it felt almost like they pushed through a barrier of some kind, the magic like water for a moment, such that Neera couldn't breathe. But then they were through, and a giant cave opened up in front of them. And it was beautiful, shimmering with gems and jewels, golden goblets and boxes and amulets scattered all over the place. How is this here? Neera asked. Why has no one ransacked the place? What do you mean? Rai asked. All these riches would be enough for any hopeless to make a new life somewhere else. Rai blinked at Neera. There is nothing here. Neera frowned and shook her head. How can you say that? Rai looked confused for a moment before his face changed, and he nodded. It's the mark, Neera. You're the chosen one. You can see things no one else can. Neera looked around at the riches and struggled to believe that Rai couldn't see any of it, that no one else was able to. There, Rai said, pointing. What's that? Neera looked in the direction he was pointing and noticed a glowing lamp on a rock pedestal. Apparently, Rai could see it too. Neera carefully climbed over the riches Rai could not see and walked toward the lamp. If she really were the chosen one, she would have to be the one to pick it up. Just before she did, the magic grew so powerful around her that she felt as though it was pressing against her skin like a giant hand. She reached for the lamp, nervous that something was going to go wrong. Nervous that the demon was going to appear and kill her, after all. Because what if Rai was wrong about the mark on her neck? What if it wasn't enough? As soon as Neera picked up the lamp, the magic disappeared. It was as if it was sucked out of the cave, and Neera could breathe easy again. Did you feel that? Neera asked Rai. Rai shook his head. I don't feel anything. For a moment, Neera wondered if Rai had ever felt the magic, or if it all had been in her head, and if she had been the only one because of the mark on her neck. What is this? Neera asked. I don't know, but I think it has something to do with the magic. And now it's mine, someone said close by, and Neera and Rai both spun around. Duran was right next to them, a smug expression on his scarred face. Where had he come from? It was as if he had just appeared. I'll take that, Duran said, snatching the lamp out of Neera's hands. She had been so shocked to see him that she hadn't thought about tucking the lamp away, hiding it from Duran. And now he had it. Laughter filled the cave and echoed around them, and when Rai and Neera turned back to the entrance, Ezel stepped in with a slew of guardians with him. I should have known you were planning this, Ezel said to Rai. Did you think if you got this magic, you would become king? Going behind my back is never a good thing, little brother. You know that's not what I'm doing here, Rai said. You can't do this to the people. I can do whatever I want, Ezel said. Rai jumped off the rock pedestal where they were standing and came face to face with his brother. He pulled his sword, and so did Ezel. Soon, they were facing off against each other. I am not going to let you hurt our people like this, Rai said. Ezel laughed. Father always said you were the more pathetic one of the two of us. And now I can see why. You're soft, Rai. You will never have what it takes to rule the nation. You are nothing but cruel, Rai said. And if you continue like this, there won't be a nation left to rule. It's natural selection, Ezel said with a shrug. So, some of them will die. Let's hope they start with the slums. The moment the prince said it, Neera's vision flashed white. She was furious that he cared nothing about her people, about what they had done for the kingdom for centuries. If it hadn't been for the slaves, the city would have fallen. They did everything the privileged and the royals were not willing to do. Your time is up, Missy, Duran said from behind Neera before grabbing her hair. She cried out, her hands flying to where his fingers knotted in her hair. Sharp pains shot into her skull as Duran yanked her around and pushed her down the few stairs that led to the rock pedestal. Duran joined her on one knee and landed right in front of her. I've been waiting for a long time to do this, slave. This is your last. Keep your hands off her. Rai shouted and stormed Duran with his sword lifted over his head. Duran turned and parried the blow, and a sword fight erupted between the two of them. Neera pushed up onto her knees and stood up, watching the fight between Duran and Rai. Duran was an excellent fighter, not only because he had been taught for years, but because he had a ruthlessness and restlessness that caused him to stop at nothing. During their fight, however, the lamp fell, and Neera saw an opportunity to grab it. Ezel's eyes locked onto Neera, and he grinned. The grin was filled with malice, and she knew she was in trouble. She scrambled toward the lamp, ready to grab it. But a guardian stepped in front of her, his face full of hatred. Neera backed away. If it was between getting the lamp and saving herself, Neera was going to choose herself. But before she could run, before she could get away, the prince's guardians circled her and stopped her from escaping. She tried to get through them, but they were like a giant wall of muscle and strength. You can run, little mouse, but you can't hide, Ezel said with a sing-song voice that only made it seem worse since she was trapped. She hated his guts. Prince Ezel was everything that was awful about Kamar. Everything Prince Rai wasn't. You will never get away with this, Neera said. Ezel laughed. And you will never live long enough to see me prove you wrong. I am the prince, soon to be king, and I shall have absolute command. Ezel stepped forward and picked up the lamp. Duran and Rai were still fighting, and it looked like it was a fight to the death. You see, the difference between my guardians and me is that they fight with brute strength. But for me, I fight with magic. The moment Ezel said it, he threw a blast of magic at Neera. The blast was so strong that she flew backward. As the guardians were blocking her from breaking free of the circle, she fell to the ground. It felt as though her skin was on fire, and Neera couldn't breathe. Ezel walked up to Neera, a devilish grin on his face. Bending down, he grabbed Neera by the throat, pulling her up. You were lucky to escape death in the arena, but you will die here today. Ezel looked toward Duran, who was still fighting Rai. As Neera watched, Duran knocked Rai in the head, and Rai sank to the ground. You were a fool, little brother. You should have known that bringing her here would only get her killed. Rai sat on the ground with his hand pressed against the wound that was gushing blood over his face. To Duran, Ezel nodded and threw the lamp. Open it. No. Neera and Rai shouted at the same time. But Duran obeyed his master and opened the lamp. Immediately, a demon emerged. And it was horrific to look at. It was made of black smoke with red eyes and sharp teeth dripping menace. It had sharp claws, and it laughed with a sound that Neera imagined was the personification of death. Free of its confines, the demon turned and started killing off the guardians. When she looked at Ezel, he didn't look worried at all. How could he not care about so many lives being lost? Do you still think this was a good idea? Ezel asked Rai. Are you starting to regret all the lives being lost because of your foolishness? It's not my foolishness, but yours, Rai said. Duran laughed, but the demon turned on him when all the other guardians were dead, and his laughter turned into a scream of terror. The demon launched itself at Duran, and in fear, Duran dropped the lamp. It fell to a ledge far below, impossible to reach. The demon chased Duran and grabbed hold of him, and his screams were piercing. Duran was thrown over the side of a cliff, his shouts fading before they stopped altogether. Neera squeezed her eyes shut. They were next, weren't they? The lamp. Rai shouted and scrambled to the edge where he looked at the ledge the lamp had landed on. He tried to brush the blood out of his face with the back of his hand, but Neera could see he struggled. She scurried to the edge as well, trying to reach it. Not so fast, Ezel said with an evil laugh. With magic, he lifted the lamp, floating it up from the ledge and into his hand. He looked at Neera and shook his head. You're pathetic. He walked to Neera and kneeled before her. She was terrified, trapped between him and the cliff behind her where Duran had fallen off. In his hand, Ezel had the lamp. She eyed it. It was so close, and yet so far. This is where your story ends, Ezel said, hitting Neera on the shoulder. But he had a knife in his hand, and the blade dove into her flesh. She cried out in pain. She tried to maintain her balance, but Ezel hit her hard enough that she fell backward. As she fell, she reached out and grabbed at him, hoping to get a hold of him so she could save herself. Instead, her hands closed around the lamp, and her momentum yanked it out of Ezel's hands. No, he shouted as Neera fell back and tumbled down the cliff, swallowed by the darkness surrounding her.